In the sweltering heat of August 1889, in the dusty railroad town of Cedar Falls, Kansas, a desperate father's crushing debt would tear apart one family and forever change the lives of twin sisters who had never imagined their world could crumble so completely. What started as the most devastating day in two young women's lives would become the beginning of a revelation that would shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about their heritage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Morrison family home as Charlotte Morrison carefully mended her father's work shirt for what she knew might be the last time. At 21, Charlotte possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from years of holding her family together through increasingly difficult circumstances. Her twin sister Victoria sat beside her, sketching in a worn leather journal, her artistic talents providing the only escape from the harsh realities that surrounded them. The Morrison twins were as different as two people sharing the same face, or could be. Charlotte had inherited their mother's practical nature and steady hands, skills that had kept their household running after Sarah Morrison's death from consumption 3 years earlier. Victoria possessed their father's creative spirit and restless energy, dreaming of art schools in Chicago and New York that seemed as distant as the moon itself. Their father, James Morrison, had once been Cedar Falls' most respected locomotive engineer, a man whose expertise with the massive steam engines had earned him steady wages and the admiration of his colleagues. The Morrison family had lived comfortably in their modest 2-story house on Elm Street, with James bringing home stories of cross-country runs and Victoria filling sketchbooks with drawings of the trains that fascinated her. But the railroad industry was changing rapidly in the late 1880s, and men like James Morrison were finding themselves casualties of progress. Newer, more efficient engines required different skills, and younger engineers were willing to work for lower wages. James had struggled to adapt, taking whatever assignments he could find, watching his seniority and salary slowly erode as the industry evolved around him. The real catastrophe began with Sarah Morrison's illness. The medical bills for her treatment had consumed their savings within months, forcing James to borrow against their home and take loans from men whose intentions were far from charitable. When Sarah finally succumbed to the disease that had ravaged her lungs, James was left not only heartbroken, but financially devastated. Charlotte remembered the exact moment she realized their father was drowning in debt. She had been organizing household papers when she discovered the collection notices hidden beneath other documents. The amounts were staggering, far beyond anything their family could hope to repay with James's irregular income. Worse still, the primary creditor was Silas Blackthorne, a man whose business practices were whispered about in the darker corners of Cedar Falls. Blackthorne operated what he called an investment and lending concern, but everyone in town knew his real business was acquiring assets from desperate families at fractions of their true value. He extended credit generously to people in crisis, with terms that seemed reasonable until the fine print revealed clauses allowing him to claim far more than the original debt. Victoria had been sketching by lamplight when Charlotte shared her discovery, her pencil freezing mid-stroke as the implications became clear. "How much does Papa owe?" Victoria asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Nearly $4,000, Charlotte replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And according to these papers, if he can't pay by month's end, Blackthorne can claim our house and everything in it." The sisters had spent that night sitting together in Victoria's room, watching their father through the window as he paced the garden, unaware that his daughters now shared the burden he had been carrying alone. James Morrison had always been a proud man, reluctant to show weakness or ask for help, and the girls understood that confronting him about the debt would only add to his shame. Over the following weeks, Charlotte and Victoria quietly began their own efforts to address the family's financial crisis. Charlotte took on additional sewing work, staying up late into the night to complete alterations and repairs for neighbors who could afford to pay. Victoria attempted to sell some of her artwork, though the market for such luxuries in Cedar Falls was practically non-existent. Their efforts, while admirable, were utterly inadequate to address the scope of their father's obligations. $4,000 was more money than most families in Cedar Falls saw in several years, and earning such a sum through sewing and art sales would have taken decades they didn't have. The confrontation with their father came when Charlotte discovered him burning papers in the backyard fire pit, his face hollow with defeat and desperation. "Papa," she said gently, approaching him as one might approach a wounded animal, "we know about the debts, we know about Blackthorn." James Morrison looked up at his daughter with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of weeks. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought I could handle it, thought I could find a way to pay it back before you girls had to know." Victoria joined them in the garden, her sketchbook forgotten as she saw the complete despair in her father's expression. "There has to be something we can do," she said. "Some way to negotiate with Blackthorn, some arrangement that gives us more time." James shook his head slowly. "I've already tried everything. Blackthorn isn't interested in extended payment plans or partial settlements. He wants full payment, and he wants it now. And if I can't provide it—" He trailed off, unable to voice the terrible alternative they all understood. The legal documents James had been attempting to destroy spelled out the consequences in clinical detail. In addition to claiming the Morrison property, Blackthorn's contracts included provisions for alternative settlement arrangements that allowed him to demand service contracts from family members to satisfy outstanding obligations. In simpler terms, if James couldn't pay his debt, Blackthorn could force the Morrison daughters into arranged marriages with men of his choosing, men who would pay him for the privilege of claiming wives who came with no choice in the matter. "He can't do that," Victoria said, her artistic temperament flaring into righteous anger. "People aren't property to be traded for money. There have to be laws against such arrangements." "The contracts are legal," James replied bitterly. "Blackthorn made sure of that. Everything is properly witnessed and filed with the territorial courts. And the men he deals with, they have enough money and influence to make sure the law works in their favor." Charlotte felt a cold realization settling in her chest. "How long do we have?" "1 week," James whispered. "The final payment is due next Friday, and if I can't produce the money, Blackthorn will exercise his claim on everything we own." The week that followed was a desperate scramble to find alternatives that didn't exist. James attempted to secure employment with other railroad companies, but his reputation had been damaged by rumors about his financial troubles. Charlotte and Victoria explored every possible option for earning money quickly, from selling their mother's jewelry to offering their services as domestic workers to wealthy families. Nothing they tried came close to generating the funds they needed. Cedar Falls was a small town with limited opportunities, and $4,000 might as well have been $4 million for all the accessibility it had to a struggling railroad family. The sisters spent long hours that week talking about their future, trying to imagine what life might hold if they were forced into marriages arranged by Silas Blackthorn. The prospect was terrifying, not just because of the loss of freedom it represented, but because of the type of men who would engage in such transactions. "I've heard stories about the men Blackthorn deals with," Charlotte said during one of their late-night conversations. "Miners and ranchers from remote areas who can't find wives through normal means. Men who view women as possessions rather than partners. Victoria had been sketching absently while they talked, her pencil creating dark, angry lines across the paper. "Maybe we should run away," she suggested. "Leave Cedar Falls before Blackthorn can execute his contracts. We could go to Chicago or Denver, find work, build new lives." The idea was tempting, but Charlotte understood its limitations. And leave Papa to face Blackthorn alone. Besides, where would we go? How would we survive in a strange city with no money and no connections? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of their father's footsteps on the stairs. James appeared in the doorway of Victoria's room, his face carrying news that both sisters immediately recognized as catastrophic. "I've just returned from a meeting with Blackthorn," he said, his voice hollow with defeat. "He's moving up the deadline. The settlement is due tomorrow morning, not next Friday." Charlotte felt the last of her hope crumble. "Why? What changed?" "He claims to have received word that I'm planning to flee town to avoid my obligations. Someone told him about my inquiries with other railroad companies, and he's interpreting that as evidence of intent to default." Victoria threw down her pencil in frustration. "This is all planned. He never intended to give us the full time. He's been maneuvering to force us into an impossible situation from the beginning." James nodded grimly. "Blackthorn has done this before with other families. The extended deadlines, the impossible terms, the legal language that seems to offer hope while actually tightening the trap. We're not his first victims, and we won't be his last." The reality of their situation settled over the Morrison family like a burial shroud. In less than 12 hours, unless a miracle occurred, Charlotte and Victoria would be standing on the courthouse steps while men bid for the right to marry them, their futures sold to settle debts they had never incurred. "There is one thing," James said, his voice so quiet the sisters had to strain to hear him. "One detail about tomorrow's proceedings that Blackthorn mentioned. He seemed unusually confident that the bidding would go according to his plans, but he also mentioned that the auction is public. Anyone with the means can participate." Charlotte understood the implication immediately. "You think someone might bid against Blackthorn's chosen buyers?" "It's possible," James replied, though his tone suggested he held little real hope. "Cedar Falls has some wealthy residents, men who might object to Blackthorn's methods, even if they can't prevent them entirely. If someone with enough money and good intentions attended the auction." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria finished the thought. "We might end up in a better situation than Blackthorn intends." It was a thin hope, but it was the only hope they had. The Morrison sisters spent their last night of freedom sitting together in Charlotte's room, holding hands and trying to imagine what the next day might bring. They had no way of knowing that their father's desperate hope would prove more prophetic than any of them dared imagine, or that the man who would change their lives forever was already in Cedar Falls, watching and waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal secrets that would transform everything they thought they knew about their family's history. The courthouse bell was already chiming dawn when Charlotte finally fell asleep, still holding Victoria's hand, both sisters dreaming of trains that carried them away from their troubles toward destinations they couldn't yet imagine. In a few hours, they would discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and that family secrets, once revealed, have the power to change everything. The morning of August 15th, 1889, dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds gathering over Cedar Falls like vultures circling wounded prey. Charlotte Morrison stood before her mother's mirror, braiding her auburn hair with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain composed. She had chosen her mother's Sunday dress, deep blue cotton with pearl buttons that had been saved for the most important occasions. If this was to be the last day she had control over her own life, she would face it with whatever dignity she could muster. Victoria paced their shared bedroom like a caged wildcat, her artistic nature rebelling against the systematic destruction of their freedom. She had torn up 3 different sketches that morning, her usual creative outlet, providing no comfort in the face of what lay ahead. Her dress was identical to Charlotte's, a deliberate choice that emphasized their twin bond and their shared fate. "I keep thinking this is a nightmare," Victoria said, stopping at the window to watch townspeople making their way toward the courthouse square. "That I'll wake up and find Papa in the kitchen making coffee, talking about his next railroad run." Charlotte finished her braid and turned to study her sister's face. Despite being twins, their personalities had always been distinctly different, but this morning they shared the same expression of determined resignation. "Whatever happens today, we face it together. We don't let them separate us, and we don't let them break us." The walk to the courthouse felt like a death march. James Morrison walked between his daughters, his shoulders bent under the weight of shame and failure. Neighbors who had known the family for years watched from their porches, some with sympathy, others with the morbid curiosity that accompanies public tragedy. Mrs. Henderson from the general store waved sadly, while Mr. Cooper, the blacksmith, removed his hat in a gesture of respect that made Charlotte's throat tighten with emotion. The courthouse square was already crowded when they arrived, filled with a mixture of legitimate townspeople and rougher-looking men who had clearly traveled from other territories specifically for this auction. Charlotte noticed several well-dressed strangers examining official documents with the focused attention of serious bidders, and her stomach churned with the realization that word of today's proceedings had spread far beyond Cedar Falls. Silas Blackthorne stood near the courthouse steps, impeccably dressed as always, overseeing the preparations with the satisfied air of a man whose careful planning was coming to fruition. He was a tall, thin man with cold grey eyes and prematurely white hair that gave him a distinguished appearance that masked his predatory nature. When he saw the Morrison family approach, his smile was as warm as winter wind. "Mr. Morrison," Blackthorne said with false cordiality, "I trust you've brought the payment we discussed. It would be unfortunate to proceed with more drastic measures when a simple financial transaction could resolve everything." James Morrison's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You know I don't have the money, Blackthorne. If I did, we wouldn't be here." "A pity," Blackthorne replied, though his tone suggested anything but regret. "Well, perhaps today's proceedings will work out favorably for everyone involved. I've taken the liberty of ensuring that qualified bidders are present, men of means who understand the value of acquiring wives with proper upbringing and domestic skills." Charlotte felt Victoria stiffen beside her at Blackthorne's casual reference to acquiring wives, but both sisters maintained their composure. They had agreed the night before that showing fear or desperation would only encourage the kind of men who engaged in such transactions. Judge William Hartley emerged from the courthouse, his face grim with distaste for the proceedings he was legally obligated to oversee. Hartley had been a friend of James Morrison for over a decade, and the fact that he was now required to auction the man's daughters was a cruel irony that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Hartley called out, his voice carrying reluctantly across the crowd, "we are here today to conduct a public auction in accordance with Kansas territorial law for the purpose of satisfying the legitimate debts of James Morrison of this county." Charlotte and Victoria took their positions on the courthouse steps, standing together with their hands clasped, presenting a united front against the degradation they were about to endure. Charlotte focused on a point above the crowd's heads, trying to maintain dignity while men evaluated her and her sister like livestock at market. The auction began with household items and personal property. Charlotte watched numbly as her mother's china set was sold to Mrs. Patterson for a fraction of its sentimental value. The family's modest library went to the schoolteacher, Mr. Adams, who at least would ensure the books were well cared for. Each item represented a piece of their family's history being stripped away and scattered to strangers. Then came the moment Charlotte had been dreading. Judge Hartley consulted his papers with obvious reluctance before making the announcement. That would change everything. "The final items for auction," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are marriage contracts for Miss Charlotte Morrison and Miss Victoria Morrison, both aged 21, skilled in domestic arts and of good moral character. Bidding will begin at $50 for each contract." The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte could hear her own heartbeat as she waited for the first voice to shatter her last moments of freedom. $50 for both contracts, called out a rough voice from the back of the crowd. Charlotte couldn't see the speaker, but his tone suggested the kind of man who viewed women as property to be owned rather than partners to be cherished. "60 for the pair," countered another voice, and Charlotte's heart sank as she realized the bidders were treating her and Victoria as a matched set rather than individual people. $100, called a third bidder, a well-dressed man in his 50s who had been studying the sisters with calculating eyes. For both contracts, with immediate marriage arrangements, Charlotte felt Victoria's hand tighten in hers as the bidding continued in steady increments. The price rose slowly but steadily, reaching $200 within minutes. She found herself studying the faces of the bidders, trying to determine which might represent the least terrible option if rescue didn't materialize. There was Marcus Webb, a successful merchant who had lost his wife the previous year and was known for his harsh treatment of employees. Gerald Foster, a mine owner from Colorado who had traveled specifically for this auction, and whose reputation for cruelty toward women was whispered about throughout the territory. And Thomas Crawford, a cattle rancher whose previous 2 wives had died under suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated. $300, Webb called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "And I'll want both contracts executed immediately with proper witnesses." Charlotte felt her knees weaken as she realized that in a matter of minutes she and Victoria might be legally bound to a man who would have complete control over their lives. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. That's when she heard the voice that would change everything. $500. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, spoken with quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. Every head turned to identify this new bidder who had just doubled the previous offer with casual ease. Charlotte opened her eyes and saw a man stepping forward from where he had been standing in the shadow of a large oak tree. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the finest clothing she had ever seen, with the bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and power. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face showed both strength and intelligence. Most remarkably, when he looked at Charlotte and Victoria, his expression showed none of the calculating hunger that characterized the other bidders. "And you are?" Judge Hartley asked, clearly as surprised as everyone else by this dramatic escalation. "In bidding, Alexander Whitmore," the man replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that Charlotte couldn't immediately place. "I represent certain business interests in the railroad industry." Charlotte felt a shock of recognition at the name, though she couldn't immediately place where she had heard it before. Beside her, Victoria gasped softly, apparently experiencing the same sense of familiarity. $500 is a substantial sum," Judge Hartley observed. "Are you prepared to honor that bid immediately?" Alexander Whitmore reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which he extracted what appeared to be a bank draft. "I am prepared to pay immediately, with additional considerations that might interest the court." Silas Blackthorne had been watching these developments with growing alarm. The bidding had already exceeded his expectations, and this mysterious newcomer threatened to disrupt carefully laid plans. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, stepping forward with forced politeness, "while your bid is generous, there are certain practical considerations about these arrangements. The young ladies in question come from modest circumstances and may not be suitable for someone of your apparent standing." Alexander Whitmore turned to face Blackthorne with the kind of controlled intensity that made dangerous men step carefully. "Mr. Blackthorne, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. I believe you've made quite a business of acquiring assets from desperate families at favorable prices." The challenge in Whitmore's voice was unmistakable, and Charlotte could see Blackthorne calculating whether to respond aggressively or retreat to safer ground. Around them, the crowd had grown silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding beyond a simple auction. "I conduct legitimate business according to territorial law," Blackthorne replied stiffly. "Everything I do is properly documented and legally sound." "I'm sure it is," Whitmore said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "just as I'm sure the Morrison family situation has been entirely beyond your influence or manipulation." Charlotte watched this exchange with growing fascination. This stranger was not only prepared to pay an enormous sum for their contracts, but he seemed to understand exactly what kind of man Blackthorne was and wasn't intimidated by him. $600, called out Marcus Webb, clearly determined not to be outbid by this newcomer. $1,000, Alexander Whitmore responded immediately, and the crowd gasped at the astronomical sum. $1,000 was more money than most families in Cedar Falls saw in 5 years. The other bidders fell silent, recognizing that they had been priced out of the competition. Charlotte felt a mixture of relief and terror as she realized this. Mysterious railroad baron was about to acquire legal control over her and Victoria's lives. "Do I hear any other bids?" Judge Hartley asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The silence stretched for a long moment before Judge Hartley raised his gavel. "Sold to Mr. Alexander Whitmore for $1,000. Charlotte felt the world shift around her as the gavel fell. In the space of a few minutes, she and Victoria had gone from facing marriage to rough miners or cruel merchants to being claimed by a wealthy stranger whose motives remained completely unknown. Alexander Whitmore approached the courthouse steps where Charlotte and Victoria still stood in stunned silence. Up close, Charlotte could see that his expensive clothes and confident bearing were accompanied by kind eyes that held none of the predatory calculation she had seen in the other bidders. "Miss Charlotte Morrison and Miss Victoria Morrison," he said formally, "I am Alexander Whitmore, and I have just acquired your marriage contracts. But before we proceed further, there are things you need to know about why I'm here and what this arrangement truly means." Charlotte found her voice despite her shock. "Mr. Whitmore, we appreciate your intervention, but we should be honest about our circumstances. We have no dowries, no social connections, and no experience with the kind of life your wealth suggests you're accustomed to." Alexander Whitmore studied her face carefully, and Charlotte thought she saw a flicker of something, recognition, admiration, in his expression. "Miss Morrison, you may find that your circumstances are quite different from what you've been led to believe. But this is neither the time nor the place for such discussions. First, we need to complete the legal formalities, and then there are revelations that will change how you understand your family's history." Victoria spoke for the first time since the bidding began. "What kind of revelations?" "The kind that explain why I traveled 800 miles specifically to attend today's auction," Alexander replied, "and why your family's situation has been of particular interest to certain parties for reasons that go far beyond simple charity." James Morrison, who had been standing in shocked silence since the bidding ended, stepped forward with confusion written across his face. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't understand. How could my daughter's situation possibly be of interest to someone of your standing? We're just a railroad family that's fallen on hard times." Alexander Whitmore turned to face James with an expression that was both gentle and profound. "Mr. Morrison, you may find that your family's connection to the railroad industry runs much deeper than you realize. But first, let's complete today's business, and then I'll explain everything." The marriage ceremony took place in Judge Hartley's chambers, with only the legally required witnesses present. Charlotte stood beside Alexander Whitmore, her hand trembling as she signed the marriage certificate that would forever change her identity from Charlotte Morrison to Charlotte Whitmore. Victoria signed identical papers, becoming Victoria Whitmore. Through a legal arrangement that neither sister fully understood, the ceremony was unlike anything Charlotte had expected. Alexander spoke his vows with genuine respect, rather than the possessive tone she had feared, and when he looked at her during the proceedings, she saw something that gave her hope, not desire or ownership, but recognition, as if he were seeing someone he had known for a long time. After the ceremony concluded and the witnesses dispersed, Alexander turned to address the Morrison family in Judge Hartley's private office. "Before we go any further, I want to make something clear. While these marriages are legally binding, they don't require anything from either of you that you're not willing to give freely. You'll have your own accommodations, your own resources, and complete freedom to make your own choices about how you spend your time and who you choose to become." Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Whitmore, you just paid an enormous sum for our marriage contracts. Surely you expect something in return." "I expect the opportunity to correct a great injustice that was done to your family many years ago," Alexander replied. "And I hope, given time and understanding, that we might build something genuine between us. But I won't demand anything from you beyond the patience to hear me explain why I'm really here." Victoria had been studying Alexander's face with the artist's eye for detail that allowed her to see things others missed. "You look familiar," she said suddenly. "I feel like I've seen you before, but I know we've never met." Alexander smiled, and for the first time, Charlotte saw genuine warmth in his expression. "You have excellent instincts, Miss Victoria. You have seen me before, or rather you've seen someone who looked very much like me. The family resemblance is quite strong." James Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing bewilderment. "What family resemblance? What are you talking about?" Alexander reached into his portfolio and withdrew a small framed photograph, which he handed to James with careful reverence. "This is a photograph of my brother, taken shortly before his death 15 years ago. I believe you knew him well." James Morrison looked at the photograph and went completely pale. His hands began to shake as he studied the face in the image, a face that was unmistakably similar to Alexander's, but younger, with the same intelligent eyes and confident bearing. "This is impossible," James whispered. "This can't be real." Charlotte moved to look at the photograph over her father's shoulder and felt her own shock as she recognized features that seemed hauntingly familiar. The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Alexander, but more than that, he shared certain characteristics with Charlotte and Victoria themselves: the shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the determined set of the jaw. "Papa," Victoria said, her voice tight with a growing realization, "who is this man?" James Morrison continued staring at the photograph as if it were a ghost come to life. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "This is Robert Whitmore. He was my best friend, my partner, and—" He paused, struggling with words that would change everything. "And he was your mother's first husband." The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that Charlotte could hear her own heartbeat. Everything she thought she knew about her family, her identity, and her place in the world suddenly shifted like ground, giving way beneath her feet. Alexander Whitmore watched the Morrison family process this information with the patience of a man who had waited years for this moment. "Now you understand why I traveled so far to be here today," he said gently. "And why has your situation been of such particular interest to me? You're not just the daughters of James Morrison, railroad engineer. You're also the daughters of Robert Whitmore, my brother and heir to one of the largest railroad fortunes in America." Charlotte felt the world spinning around her as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. They weren't the impoverished daughters of a struggling railroad worker. They were heirs to wealth and position beyond anything they had ever imagined. And the man who had just married them wasn't a stranger taking advantage of their desperation. He was their uncle, coming to reclaim a family that had been lost to circumstances they were only beginning to understand. "Tomorrow," Alexander said, "I'll begin explaining everything, how your father met your mother, why your true heritage was hidden, and what it means for your future. But tonight, I think we all need time to absorb what's been revealed." As they left the courthouse together, Charlotte realized that the auction that had seemed like the end of everything was actually the beginning of a completely different life. The desperate morning had become the first chapter of a story she never could have imagined, and the stranger who had saved them was about to transform them from abandoned daughters into inheritors of a legacy that would change not just their circumstances, but their understanding of who they truly were. The girl who had stood on the courthouse steps in fear and resignation was gone, replaced by a woman who was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that family connections, once revealed, have the power to rewrite history itself. The Whitmore estate carriage rolled through the streets of Cedar Falls as the sun set behind the Kansas prairie, carrying a family forever changed by the day's revelations. Charlotte sat across from Alexander Whitmore, studying this man who had transformed from mysterious stranger to uncle in the span of a single afternoon. Victoria clutched their father's hand, her artistic mind struggling to process the magnitude of what they had learned about their heritage. James Morrison stared out the carriage window, lost in memories he had buried for over 2 decades. The photograph of Robert Whitmore remained in his hands, and periodically he would glance at it, as if trying to reconcile the young man he had known with the wealthy railroad baron Alexander described. "I think," Alexander said gently, breaking the silence that had enveloped them since leaving the courthouse, "it's time I explained how your parents' story truly began, and why circumstances led to such an elaborate deception about your family's identity." Charlotte found her voice first. "Before you begin, I need to understand something. If we're truly your nieces, if our mother was married to your brother, why did you let us grow up in poverty? Why did you allow us to reach the point where we were being auctioned to pay debts?" The pain that crossed Alexander's face was genuine and profound. "Because until 3 months ago, I believed you were dead. I believed your mother died in the same train accident that killed my brother, and that any children from their marriage had perished with her." Victoria leaned forward, her artist's instincts drawn to the emotional truth in Alexander's expression. "What changed 3 months ago? A private investigator I had hired to locate a missing railroad payroll stumbled across birth records in Kansas City that included the names Charlotte and Victoria Whitmore, born to Sarah Whitmore and Robert Whitmore in December 1867. When he researched further, he discovered that Sarah Whitmore had survived the train accident and later remarried, taking the name Morrison. James Morrison looked up from the photograph with haunted eyes. "You hired investigators to find us." "I hired investigators to find the truth about what happened to my brother's family," Alexander corrected. "Robert died believing he had lost everything that mattered to him. If there was any chance that his children had survived, I was determined to locate them and ensure they received their rightful inheritance. The carriage turned onto a tree-lined street Charlotte had never seen before, approaching a magnificent mansion that stood in stark contrast to the modest homes that characterized most of Cedar Falls. Gas lamps illuminated a three-story brick structure with elaborate stonework and expansive grounds that spoke of wealth beyond anything the Morrison sisters had ever imagined. "This is your temporary residence," Alexander explained as the carriage drew to a halt. "I purchased this property last month when I learned you were living in Cedar Falls. The staff has been preparing accommodations suitable for members of the Whitmore family." Charlotte stepped from the carriage and stared up at the imposing structure that was apparently now her home. "You bought this entire house for us?" "I bought this house as a gesture of respect for what you've endured and as a first step toward restoring your rightful position in society," Alexander replied. "But more importantly, I bought it as a place where we could have the privacy needed to discuss family matters without the entire town speculating about our conversations." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than its exterior, with crystal chandeliers, imported furnishings, and artwork that transformed the space into something from Victoria's most ambitious dreams. A staff of servants waited to greet them, led by a distinguished older woman who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to managing grand households. "This is Mrs. Catherine Bennett," Alexander said, introducing the woman. "She has managed Whitmore family properties for over 20 years and will oversee your household arrangements. Mrs. Bennett, please ensure that Mrs. Charlotte Whitmore and Mrs. Victoria Whitmore have everything they need to settle in comfortably." The use of their new married names still felt strange to Charlotte, but she was beginning to understand that this formal recognition was part of Alexander's effort to restore their social standing. "Mrs. Bennett, we're grateful for your assistance, but we should warn you that we have no experience with household staff or formal arrangements." Mrs. Bennett smiled warmly. "Miss Charlotte, Mrs. Whitmore, your mother was much the same when she first joined the family. She adapted beautifully, and I have no doubt you will as well. Your rooms have been prepared according to the information Mr. Alexander provided about your preferences." As they were shown to their accommodations, Charlotte marveled at the attention to detail that had gone into preparing their new home. Her room was furnished with pieces that reflected both luxury and comfort, while Victoria's space included an artist's studio complete with easels, paints, and drawing supplies that represented a fortune in materials. "How did you know about Victoria's artistic interests?" Charlotte asked Alexander as they reconvened in the mansion's library. "The same investigators who located you also researched your backgrounds thoroughly," Alexander replied. "I wanted to understand who you had become during the years we were separated, so I could ensure that your true interests and talents were supported rather than suppressed." The library itself was a magnificent space with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable reading chairs, and a fireplace that cast warm light across leather-bound volumes. James Morrison moved among the shelves with wonder, running his fingers along spines of books he had only dreamed of owning. "Now," Alexander said, settling into a chair near the fireplace, "let me tell you the story of how your parents met, why their marriage was kept secret, and how a train accident changed everything." Charlotte and Victoria took seats on either side of their father, creating a semicircle around Alexander as he began to unveil the history that had shaped their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Your mother, Sarah Catherine Walsh, was the daughter of a Kansas City storekeeper who died when she was 18, leaving her with modest inheritance but few prospects for advancement. She took a position as a governess with the Henderson family in 1865, teaching their children and managing their household with the kind of efficiency that brought her to the attention of other wealthy families. Victoria had pulled out her sketchbook and was drawing as Alexander spoke, her hands capturing the emotions of his story, even as her mind absorbed the details. How did she meet Robert? My brother was 25 in 1866, heir to the Whitmore Railroad fortune, but rebellious about the expectations that came with wealth and position. He had been sent to Kansas City to oversee the construction of a new rail line, work that our father hoped would teach him responsibility and prepare him for eventually taking control of the family business. Alexander paused to pour brandy for himself and James, offering wine to Charlotte and Victoria. The formality of the gesture emphasized that they were now being treated as adults, capable of hearing difficult truths about their family's history. Robert was brilliant with railroad engineering and construction, but he chafed under the social restrictions that governed wealthy families in the 1860s. He was expected to marry within his social class, to choose a wife based on family connections and financial advantages rather than personal compatibility or genuine affection. Charlotte understood immediately. He fell in love with our mother despite the social differences. He fell in love with her because of her intelligence, her strength, and her refusal to be intimidated by wealth or position, Alexander confirmed. Sarah Walsh was unlike any woman Robert had ever met. She was educated, independent, and completely unimpressed by the Whitmore family name or fortune. James Morrison looked up from his contemplation of the book titles. She was still like that when I met her. Sarah never cared about money or status. She judged people by their character and their actions, nothing else. The courtship between Robert and Sarah lasted nearly a year, Alexander continued. They met in secret, communicating through letters and clandestine meetings that violated every social convention of the time. Robert knew that our father would never approve of the match, while Sarah understood that marrying into the Whitmore family would bring her into a world where she would always be viewed as an outsider. Victoria looked up from her sketching. But they married anyway. They married in a private ceremony in January 1867, with only 2 witnesses present and no family members from either side. Robert had planned to present the marriage to our father as a fait accompli, hoping that once the deed was done, the family would accept Sarah rather than risk a public scandal. The pain in Alexander's voice suggested that this strategy had not succeeded. Charlotte felt a growing sense of dread about what had happened to tear her parents apart. What went wrong? Our father, Harrison Whitmore, was a man who believed that family bloodlines and social position were sacred trusts that could not be compromised for individual desires. When Robert announced his marriage, Harrison threatened to disinherit him completely unless he agreed to have the marriage annulled and choose a more suitable wife. Alexander moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames as if they contained images of the past he was describing. Robert refused, of course. He loved Sarah deeply and believed that our father would eventually relent once he had time to adjust to the situation. But he didn't relent, Charlotte said, understanding the trajectory of the story. Harrison Whitmore was as stubborn as he was wealthy. He cut off Robert's access to family funds, removed him from his position with the railroad company, and made it clear that as long as he remained married to Sarah, he would have no place in the Whitmore family. James Morrison set down his brandy with a heavy sigh. I remember when Robert first told me about the situation. He was torn between his love for Sarah and his sense of responsibility to the family business. The Whitmore Railroad employed thousands of people, and Robert knew that his father's threats weren't empty. For 6 months, Robert and Sarah lived on his savings while he tried to find work with other railroad companies. Alexander continued, but Harrison Whitmore's influence extended throughout the industry. Every opportunity Robert pursued mysteriously disappeared. Every offer of employment was withdrawn at the last moment. Victoria had stopped sketching, her face pale with understanding. Our grandfather deliberately sabotaged Robert's career to force him to choose between our mother and his inheritance. Harrison believed he was protecting the family's interests and Robert's future, Alexander replied. He was convinced that Robert would eventually come to his senses and realize that his infatuation with an unsuitable woman was threatening everything the Whitmore family had built. The cruelty of the situation was becoming clear to Charlotte. So Robert was forced to choose between love and responsibility, between his wife and his family's legacy. The crisis came to a head in the fall of 1867, when Sarah discovered she was pregnant with twins. Robert realized that he could no longer afford to wait for his father's change of heart. He needed steady employment and financial security to support his growing family. Alexander returned to his chair, his expression heavy with the weight of family tragedy. Robert made the most difficult decision of his life. He accepted a position with the Union Pacific Railroad, work that would take him away from Kansas City for months at a time, but would provide the income Sarah needed. The position involved surveying railroad routes through Colorado Territory, dangerous work in remote areas where construction crews faced harsh weather, difficult terrain, and occasional conflicts with hostile groups who opposed railroad expansion. Robert planned to complete one major survey contract, earn enough money to establish financial independence, and then return to Kansas City to build a new life with Sarah and their children. James Morrison's voice was barely audible when he spoke, but he never came back. The train carrying Robert and his survey team derailed in a mountain pass in February 1868 during a severe winter storm. The accident occurred in such a remote area that rescue teams didn't reach the site for over a week. By the time they arrived, there were no survivors. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Charlotte felt tears building as she imagined her mother's devastation at learning that her husband had died in such a terrible way, leaving her alone with newborn twins and no family support. "What happened to our mother after Robert died?" Victoria asked, her voice tight with emotion. Sarah received word of Robert's death while she was still recovering from childbirth. She had no family of her own to turn to, no resources beyond the small amount of money Robert had left, and no legal claim to the Whitmore family fortune since Harrison had never acknowledged their marriage. Alexander's voice carried the weight of old guilt as he continued. Harrison learned of Robert's death and the existence of grandchildren, but his pride prevented him from reaching out to Sarah. He convinced himself that she and the children would be better off without the complications that came with Whitmore family connections. So he abandoned them, Charlotte said, anger building in her voice. He let his own grandchildren grow up in poverty rather than admit he had been wrong about our mother. Harrison Whitmore died 2 years later, taking his regrets and his pride to the grave. By the time I inherited control of the family business and began looking for Robert's widow and children, Sarah had disappeared completely. James Morrison finally joined the conversation, his voice heavy with old pain. Sarah never told me the complete truth about her first marriage. She said her husband had died in a railroad accident and that his family had rejected her, but she never mentioned the Whitmore name or the extent of the wealth involved. She was protecting herself and her children, Alexander said gently. Sarah had learned that the Whitmore family name brought more pain than benefit. When she met you, James, she saw a chance to build a new life based on love and mutual respect rather than wealth and social position. Charlotte was beginning to understand the full scope of the deception that had shaped their lives. So when she married Papa, she deliberately concealed our true identity to protect us from a family that had already rejected us once. Sarah changed. Your names from Whitmore to Morrison altered your birth date slightly and created new histories that would allow you to grow up as normal children rather than disinherited heiresses to a fortune that might never be recoverable. Victoria looked up from her sketchbook, where she had been unconsciously drawing images that reflected the story they were hearing. She sacrificed our inheritance to give us the chance for genuine happiness. And it worked, James Morrison added. You had a loving home, a stable family, and the freedom to develop your own interests and personalities without the pressure and scrutiny that comes with great wealth. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Sarah made choices that demonstrated remarkable wisdom and strength. She understood that money without love is worthless, while love without money can still create a meaningful life. But now everything has changed again, Charlotte said, looking around the magnificent library that represented their new reality. Now we're Whitmores again, with all the responsibilities and complications that come with that name. You're Whitmores by birth and by right, Alexander confirmed, but you're also Morrisons by choice and by experience. You have the unique advantage of understanding both worlds, of appreciating both wealth and simplicity. The evening had grown, late while Alexander shared their family's history, and Charlotte realized that she was exhausted by the emotional weight of everything they had learned. Uncle Alexander, she said, using the family designation for the first time, I need time to process all of this, to understand what it means for our future and how we're supposed to navigate a world we've never been part of. Of course, Alexander replied with understanding. Tomorrow we'll begin the practical aspects of your education as members of the Whitmore family. There are business interests to learn about, social obligations to understand, and decisions to make about how you want to use your inheritance. As they prepared to retire to their respective rooms, Victoria approached Alexander with her sketchbook. I drew this while you were telling our mother's story, she said, showing him a portrait of a young woman with determined eyes and gentle hands. Is this how you remember her? Alexander studied the drawing carefully, his expression soft with memory. That's exactly how she looked when Robert first brought her to meet me. You've captured not just her appearance, but her spirit. She would be proud of the women you've become. Charlotte felt a warmth spreading through her chest at the recognition that they had inherited more than just money and property. They had inherited a legacy of strength, love, and determination that had carried their mother through unimaginable challenges. As she settled into her luxurious new bedroom that night, Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in a single day. She had awakened as Charlotte Morrison, desperate daughter of a struggling railroad worker. She was falling asleep as Charlotte Whitmore, heiress to a railroad fortune and wife to a man who had rescued her from circumstances that seemed hopeless. But, more than that, she was beginning to understand that her true inheritance wasn't money or property or social position. It was the strength and wisdom that had been passed down through generations of Whitmore women, including a mother who had sacrificed everything to ensure her daughters had the chance to choose their own destinies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight Charlotte was content to rest in the knowledge that she finally understood who she truly was and where she had come from. The lost Whitmore heiresses had been found, and their story was just beginning. Dawn broke over Cedar Falls with a golden light that transformed the mansion's gardens into something from a fairy tale. Charlotte Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, still adjusting to the luxury that surrounded her, watching gardeners tend to flower beds that probably cost more to maintain than her family's entire annual income had been just days ago. The reality of her new circumstances felt both thrilling and overwhelming. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of Mary Sullivan, a young Irish woman who had been assigned as Charlotte's personal maid. The concept of having someone dedicated to assisting with her daily needs was foreign to Charlotte. who had spent years caring for herself and managing her family's household. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Mary said with a cheerful smile as she entered carrying a silver tray laden with fresh coffee, warm pastries, and what appeared to be several official-looking documents. "Mr. Alexander asked me to inform you that he'll be conducting business meetings this morning to acquaint you and Miss Victoria with the Whitmore Railroad operations." Charlotte accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma of beans that were clearly of much higher quality than anything the Morrison family had been able to afford. "Mary, I should mention that I'm not accustomed to personal service. You don't need to wait on me as if I were helpless." "Oh, but Mrs. Whitmore, it's not about helplessness at all," Mary replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Alexander explained that you and your sister have important business to learn and social obligations to fulfill. My job is to handle the daily details so you can focus on more significant matters." The documents on the tray proved to be educational materials Alexander had compiled about railroad operations, financial statements, and what appeared to be organizational charts showing the structure of the Whitmore business empire. Charlotte studied them while she dressed, beginning to understand the scope of the enterprise she had inherited. The Whitmore Railroad Company wasn't simply a single rail line, but a vast network of interconnected businesses that included freight, operations, passenger services, land development, mining interests, and manufacturing concerns. The financial statements showed profits that exceeded the annual budgets of some territorial governments. Victoria appeared at Charlotte's door as she was reviewing a particularly complex document about land acquisition strategies. Her twin sister looked as overwhelmed as Charlotte felt, carrying her own stack of papers and wearing an expression of bewildered fascination. "Did you see the document about the locomotive manufacturing plant in Pittsburgh?" Victoria asked, settling into a chair near Charlotte's window. "We apparently own a facility that builds the actual trains, not just operates them." "And according to this," Charlotte replied, holding up a financial summary, "we own timber forests in Oregon, coal mines in Pennsylvania, and grain elevators in Nebraska. The railroad is just the center of a web of businesses that support each other." The sisters spent the next hour reviewing documents that revealed the true extent of their inheritance. They weren't simply wealthy, they were part of an industrial empire that employed thousands of people and influenced the economic development of entire regions. Alexander appeared at Charlotte's door precisely at 9 o'clock, dressed in formal business attire and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested the morning's education would be comprehensive and detailed. "Good morning, ladies," he said warmly. "I trust you slept well in your new accommodations." "The beds are more comfortable than anything we've ever experienced," Victoria replied honestly. "But I'm not sure either of us slept much. We spent most of the night trying to understand the scope of what we've inherited." "An intelligent approach," Alexander approved. "Understanding the responsibility that comes with wealth is far more important than simply enjoying its privileges. Shall we begin your education in the practical aspects of railroad management?" The morning's first stop was Alexander's private office, a magnificent room on the mansion's second floor that had been converted into a command center for managing railroad operations across multiple territories. Maps covered the walls, showing rail lines, proposed routes, and competing transportation systems. Telegraph equipment allowed instant communication with managers in distant cities, while filing cabinets contained correspondence with government officials, business partners, and potential investors. "The modern railroad business," Alexander explained as he guided them through the various organizational systems, "requires coordination of activities across vast distances and careful attention to details that can make the difference between a profit and disaster." He showed them scheduling boards that tracked the movement of hundreds of trains across thousands of miles of track, ensuring that freight and passenger services operated efficiently without conflicts or delays. The complexity was staggering, requiring mathematical precision and split-second timing that Charlotte was only beginning to appreciate. "Each train on our system," Alexander continued, pointing to colored markers on a large map, "represents an investment of tens of thousands of dollars in equipment, cargo, and personnel. A single mistake in scheduling can result in collisions, delays that cascade throughout the entire network, or the loss of valuable contracts to competing companies." Victoria studied the maps with her artist's eye for spatial relationships. "It's like a giant clockwork mechanism, where every piece has to move in perfect coordination with every other piece." "Exactly," Alexander confirmed. "And unlike a clock, this mechanism operates across weather conditions, geographical obstacles, and human factors that can change without warning." Charlotte found herself drawn to the financial ledgers that tracked revenues, expenses, and profit margins for different aspects of the business. Her experience managing the Morrison family's limited resources had taught her to pay careful attention to monetary details, skills that translated well to understanding railroad economics. "The freight business generates the most consistent revenue," she observed, studying the monthly reports. "But passenger services seem to have higher profit margins when demand is strong." "Very good," Alexander said with obvious approval. "You've identified one of the key strategic decisions in railroad management. Freight provides stability, but passenger services offer growth opportunities if managed correctly. The next phase of their education involved meeting the key personnel who manage day-to-day operations for the Whitmore Railroad." Alexander had arranged for several department heads to travel to Cedar Falls specifically to brief the new heiresses on their respective areas of responsibility. Thomas McCarthy, the operations manager, was a gruff Irishman with 30 years of railroad experience who had worked his way up from track maintenance to system-wide coordination. He explained the practical challenges of maintaining thousands of miles of track, managing locomotive maintenance schedules, and ensuring that freight deliveries met customer expectations. "The railroad business isn't glamorous, ladies," McCarthy said with typical directness. "It's about moving heavy things over long distances safely and on time. Everything else is just decoration." Catherine Williams, the passenger services coordinator, brought a different perspective to their education. A sophisticated woman in her 40s who had managed hotel operations before joining the railroad, she focused on the customer service aspects that made rail travel attractive to people with choices about transportation. "Our passenger trains compete with stagecoaches, riverboats, and increasingly with people's decision to simply stay home," Williams explained. "We succeed by making rail travel more comfortable, more reliable, and more enjoyable than the alternatives." The most fascinating presentation came from Marcus Thompson, who managed the railroad's land development operations. Thompson explained how railroad companies acquired vast tracts of land along their routes, then developed those holdings into towns, farming communities, and industrial centers that generated additional revenue streams. "Every mile of track we build increases the value of the land surrounding it," Thompson said, showing the maps that illustrated this principle. "We don't just transport goods and people, we create the communities that generate the need for transportation." Charlotte began to understand that the Whitmore Railroad was not simply a transportation company, but a force for Western development that shaped the growth of entire regions. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting. The afternoon brought their first exposure to the political aspects of railroad management. Alexander arranged a meeting with Senator Robert Harrison, a Kansas politician whose support was crucial for obtaining government contracts and favorable legislation. "The railroad business operates at the intersection of private enterprise and public policy," Senator Harrison explained as they met in the mansion's formal parlor. Your success depends not only on efficient operations, but also on maintaining positive relationships with territorial and federal governments. Harrison outlined the complex web of regulations, subsidies, and political considerations that influenced railroad operations. Land grants from the federal government had provided much of the initial capital for Western expansion, but those grants came with obligations for service to remote communities and cooperation with military transportation needs. The Whitmore name carries significant influence in political circles, Harrison continued. Your family's support for Western development and commitment to fair business practices has earned respect from both Republicans and Democrats. Victoria had been sketching throughout the meeting, capturing not just the senator's appearance, but the dynamics of political discussion. Senator Harrison, what happens if we make decisions that some politicians disagree with? Then you'll discover that politics can be as competitive and ruthless as any business, Harrison replied with a knowing smile. The key is maintaining relationships with people across the political spectrum and avoiding positions that make you unnecessary enemies. As the sun began to set, Alexander gathered Charlotte and Victoria in the mansion's library for a summary of their first day's education. Both sisters looked exhausted by the volume of information they had absorbed, but also energized by the possibilities they were beginning to understand. "I want you to know," Alexander said, as they settled into comfortable chairs near the fireplace, "that I don't expect you to master all of this immediately. Managing a railroad empire is something that takes years to learn properly, but we do need to learn it," Charlotte said with determination. "This is our inheritance and our responsibility. We can't simply enjoy the benefits while leaving all the work to others." "I'm glad you understand that," Alexander replied. "Your mother had the same sense of responsibility when she married my brother. She refused to be simply a decorative wife and insisted on understanding the business that would support her family." Victoria looked up from her sketchbook, where she had been drawing images that reflected the day's experiences. "Uncle Alexander, I need to ask you something that's been troubling me. Are there people who object to our inheritance? People who think we don't deserve this wealth or position?" The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Alexander was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte sensed that Victoria had touched on something significant that he had been reluctant to discuss. "There are always people who question sudden changes in wealth and power," Alexander said carefully. "Some will argue that you haven't earned your inheritance through personal effort. Others may have their own interests in Whitmore Railroad properties and contracts." "What kind of interests?" Charlotte asked, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "Competing railroad companies who would benefit from our failure, politicians who oppose our influence in territorial development, businessmen who have been waiting for opportunities to acquire Whitmore assets at favorable prices." Alexander moved to his desk and withdrew a folder that he handled with obvious reluctance. "I received word yesterday that certain parties are already questioning the legitimacy of your inheritance and your qualifications to manage railroad operations." Charlotte felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What kind of questioning?" "Legal challenges claiming that your mother's marriage to my brother was never properly documented. Business competitors arguing that inexperienced women shouldn't control transportation systems that affect interstate commerce. Social critics suggest that your background makes you unsuitable for positions of influence." Victoria's sketchpad fell to her lap as she absorbed the implications of what Alexander was saying. "So we're not just learning to manage a railroad empire, we're also going to have to fight to keep it." "I'm afraid that's an accurate assessment," Alexander confirmed. "Wealth and power always attract opposition from people who want those things for themselves. The weight of this revelation settled over the sisters like a heavy blanket. Charlotte had thought their greatest challenge would be learning to manage inherited wealth responsibly. Now she understood that they might have to fight for the right to keep that inheritance at all. "What do we need to do to protect ourselves?" she asked, calling upon the same determination that had carried her through her family's previous crisis. "You need to demonstrate competence in railroad management quickly and publicly," Alexander replied. "You need to build alliances with people who can support your legitimacy, and you need to be prepared for challenges that may come from unexpected directions." James Morrison, who had been quietly observing the day's activities, finally spoke from his position near the window. "These girls have already survived one attempt to destroy their lives through legal manipulation. They're stronger than they appear, and they're not easily intimidated." "I'm counting on that strength," Alexander said, looking at Charlotte and Victoria with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. "Because the challenges ahead may be more difficult than anything you've faced so far." As they prepared to end their first day of business education, Charlotte realized that inheriting the Whitmore fortune was not the fairy tale ending she had briefly imagined. Instead, it was the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one that would require every skill they had developed during their years of adversity. "Tomorrow," Alexander said, "we'll begin your practical education in railroad operations. You'll meet with locomotive engineers, track maintenance crews, and station managers. You'll learn the business from the ground up so that when critics question your qualifications, you can respond with knowledge and experience." Charlotte stood and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds that were now her responsibility. "Uncle Alexander, I want you to know that Victoria and I aren't afraid of hard work or challenges. We've been preparing for this our entire lives, even though we didn't know it." "How so?" Alexander asked with curiosity. "We learned to manage limited resources efficiently. We learned to make difficult decisions under pressure. We learned that survival sometimes requires taking risks that others consider dangerous or inappropriate." Victoria joined her sister at the window, and together they looked out at the railroad empire they had inherited. "Most importantly," Victoria added, "we learned that family loyalty and mutual support can overcome obstacles that seem impossible to individual effort." Alexander smiled, and for the first time since revealing their inheritance, he looked genuinely optimistic about their prospects. "Then you have exactly the qualities needed to succeed in the railroad business and to protect what your parents sacrificed so much to preserve." As Charlotte retired to her luxurious bedroom that night, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that continued to unfold in her life. Yesterday, she had been preparing for an auction that would end her freedom. Tonight, she was preparing for a battle that would determine whether she could keep the freedom and responsibility she had unexpectedly inherited. The stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time in years, Charlotte felt that she and Victoria had both the resources and the allies needed to prevail against whatever opposition they might face. The lost Whitmore heiresses had been found, educated, and were rapidly becoming forces to be reckoned with in their own right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove themselves worthy of the empire they had inherited. Charlotte was ready for whatever came next. The morning of Charlotte and Victoria's first practical railroad experience dawned crisp and clear, with autumn colors painting the Kansas landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The twins stood on the platform of the Cedar Falls depot, dressed in practical traveling clothes that Mrs. Bennett had procured for their education in field operations. Their destination was the Whitmore Railroad's regional hub in Topeka, where they would observe actual train operations and meet the crews who kept the empire functioning. Alexander stood beside them, reviewing telegrams that had arrived during the night with updates from various railroad operations across their territory. His expression grew increasingly grave as he read, and Charlotte noticed the tension building in his shoulders. "Bad news?" she asked, having learned to read the subtle signs that indicated problems in the complex world of railroad management. "Concerning developments," Alexander replied carefully. "It appears that our opponents are moving more quickly than I anticipated. There have been 3 separate incidents in the past week that suggest coordinated efforts to damage our operations." Victoria looked up from her sketchbook, where she had been drawing the bustling activity of the train depot. "What kind of incidents?" "A bridge on our main line between Kansas City and Denver was damaged by what local authorities are calling accidental explosions from nearby mining operations. 2 of our locomotive engineers received offers for significantly higher wages from competing companies, offers that came with suggestions that their current employment might become unstable. And a territorial judge who has been supportive of our expansion projects suddenly announced his intention to review all pending railroad contracts for compliance irregularities." Charlotte felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had become her constant companion since learning about their inheritance. "None of those sound like coincidences." "They're not," Alexander confirmed grimly. "Someone with substantial resources and influence is orchestrating a campaign to weaken our position before we can establish ourselves as legitimate heirs to the Whitmore Empire." The arrival of their train interrupted the conversation, but Charlotte could see that Alexander's concerns were weighing heavily on his mind. As they settled into the luxurious private car that served as mobile headquarters for railroad executives, she realized that their education was about to take on an urgency that went far beyond normal business training. The journey to Topeka provided an opportunity to observe railroad operations from the inside. Charlotte and Victoria took turns in the locomotive cab, learning to read the complex gauges and controls that governed the massive steam engines. The engineer, a weathered man named Bill Harrison, who had been with the Whitmore Railroad for 15 years, explained the technical aspects of train operation with the patience of someone who genuinely loved his work. "Running a locomotive isn't just about making her go fast," Harrison explained, as he adjusted the throttle to maintain optimal speed through a series of curves. "You've got to understand the track conditions, the weight of your cargo, the weather, and a dozen other factors that can change from mile to mile." Victoria was fascinated by the mechanical precision required, while Charlotte found herself drawn to the logistical complexity of coordinating multiple trains across the same tracks. Both sisters demonstrated the quick learning ability that had served them well during their years of managing family crises. The real education began when they reached Topeka and met with the regional operations staff. The Whitmore Railroad's hub facility was an impressive complex of repair shops, freight warehouses, passenger stations, and administrative offices that employed nearly 200 people and served as the coordination center for rail traffic. Across central Kansas, Margaret Thompson, the assistant operations manager, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had started as a telegraph operator and worked her way up through sheer competence and determination. She briefed the twins on the daily challenges of managing regional rail operations with the kind of practical detail that couldn't be learned from documents and reports. Yesterday's problems included a broken axle on freight locomotive 247, which delayed 6 scheduled trains and required rerouting cargo through alternate routes, Thompson explained as she led them through the bustling operations center. "We had a passenger train stuck for 3 hours when a cattle drive crossed the tracks at an unscheduled time, and we discovered that someone had been tampering with telegraph lines between here and Junction City." Charlotte's attention sharpened at the mention of tampering. "What kind of tampering?" "Lines cut cleanly with wire cutters, not the kind of damage you'd expect from weather or accidental contact," Thompson replied. Our repair crew said it looked deliberate, though they couldn't determine who might have done it or why. Alexander and Charlotte exchanged meaningful glances. The telegraph sabotage fit the pattern of coordinated harassment that seemed designed to disrupt Whitmore Railroad operations without causing enough damage to warrant major law enforcement investigation. The afternoon brought their first direct encounter with the opposition that Alexander had warned them about. As they toured the freight loading facilities, a well-dressed stranger approached, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, extending his hand with false cordiality. "I'm Edwin Blackwood, representing the Kansas Central Railroad Company. I understand you're introducing your new partners to railroad operations." Alexander's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more formal and guarded. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't aware that Kansas Central had business interests in Topeka." "We're exploring expansion opportunities," Blackwood replied smoothly, his gaze moving to Charlotte and Victoria with calculating assessment. "I understand these young ladies have recently acquired significant holdings in railroad properties." Charlotte stepped forward, drawing upon the confidence she had developed during her business education. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Charlotte Whitmore, and this is my sister, Victoria. We're learning about the railroad operations we've inherited." Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. "How fascinating. I trust you understand the complexity and risks involved in railroad management. It's not work that everyone is suited for, regardless of their legal claims to ownership." The insult was delivered with such polite phrasing that it took Charlotte a moment to process its full implications. When she did, her response was swift and pointed. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern for our welfare, but we're quite capable of determining our own suitability for business management." "Of course," Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested anything but agreement. "I simply wanted to mention that Kansas Central is always interested in acquiring railroad properties from owners who might prefer to liquidate their holdings rather than face the challenges of active management." Victoria had been studying Blackwood with her artist's eye for character, and she stepped forward with a deceptively sweet smile. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Blackwood. What kind of price would Kansas Central offer for properties that they clearly believe are too challenging for the current owners to manage successfully?" The question caught Blackwood off guard, and his practiced composure slipped slightly. "Well, naturally, any offer would depend on detailed evaluation of the assets involved." "Naturally," Charlotte agreed, "and I'm sure such an evaluation would result in offers that reflect the true market value of railroad properties, rather than distressed prices that take advantage of owners facing artificially created difficulties." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he realized that the Whitmore heiresses were not going to be easily intimidated or manipulated. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore," Charlotte corrected firmly. "And I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that we're aware of recent incidents affecting our operations, and we're prepared to respond appropriately to any threats against our business interests." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Thompson, who'd been observing the exchange from a distance and decided to intervene. "Mr. Blackwood, if you have official business with Whitmore Railroad, you'll need to schedule appointments through proper channels. This is a working facility, not a social gathering." Blackwood understood that he had lost the initiative and was no longer welcome. "Of course. Ladies, it's been educational. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to continue our discussion in the future." After Blackwood's departure, Alexander gathered Charlotte and Victoria in the privacy of the regional manager's office. His expression was grim, and the twins could see that the encounter had confirmed his worst fears about the opposition they would face. Edwin Blackwood represents more than just a competing railroad company, Alexander explained. Kansas Central is backed by a consortium of Eastern investors who specialize in acquiring Western properties through aggressive business practices and political manipulation. Charlotte felt a chill of recognition. Like Silas Blackthorne, but on a much larger scale. Exactly. They identify successful family businesses, create artificial crises that threaten financial stability, then offer to purchase assets at fractions of their true value. They've absorbed over a dozen smaller railroad companies using these tactics. Victoria had pulled out her sketchbook and was drawing while they talked, her hands capturing images that reflected the tension and conflict they had just experienced. What makes them think they can apply the same tactics to us? They're betting that two young women with no railroad experience will be overwhelmed by the challenges of managing a complex business while facing coordinated opposition, Alexander replied. They expect us to make mistakes that provide them with legal or financial opportunities to force a sale. The remainder of their day in Topeka was spent developing strategies to counter the threats they now knew they were facing. Alexander introduced them to key personnel who could be trusted to report suspicious activities, and they reviewed security procedures designed to protect both railroad operations and family members. Margaret Thompson proved to be an invaluable ally with connections throughout the regional railroad community that provided early warning about competitive threats and political developments. The word is spreading that Kansas Central is offering premium wages to experienced Whitmore Railroad employees, she reported during their strategy session. They're trying to steal our best people by creating financial incentives that are hard to refuse. Can we match their offers? Charlotte asked, her mind working through the financial implications. We can, but it would strain our operating budget and set a precedent that other competitors could exploit, Alexander replied. A better approach might be to offer our employees benefits that go beyond simple wages, profit sharing, advancement opportunities, family support programs that create loyalty rather than just financial incentives. Victoria looked up from her sketching with sudden inspiration. What about community investment? If we help our employees build better lives in the towns where they work, they'll have reasons to stay that go beyond what any competing company can offer. The idea had merit, and they spent the rest of the afternoon developing plans for employee housing, educational programs, and community development projects that would strengthen their workforce while demonstrating their commitment to regional growth. As evening approached, they prepared for the return journey to Cedar Falls, but their departure was delayed by the arrival of a telegram that would change everything. Alexander read the message twice before sharing its contents with Charlotte and Victoria, his expression grave with implications they were only beginning to understand. This is from our legal representatives in Kansas City, he said slowly. Kansas. Central Railroad has filed a formal challenge to your inheritance, claiming that your mother's marriage to my brother was never legally valid and that you have no legitimate claim to Whitmore Railroad properties. Charlotte felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she absorbed this news. On what grounds? They're arguing that Robert and Sarah's marriage violated territorial laws regarding property rights and inheritance, and that any children from that union cannot inherit assets that were never legally transferred to their father in the first place. Victoria's pencil snapped in her hand as she gripped it too tightly. Can they do that? Can they simply challenge our inheritance through the courts? They can challenge anything they want, Alexander replied grimly. Whether they can win is another question entirely. But the legal process could tie up our assets for months or years while the case works its way through the courts. The train ride back to Cedar Falls passed in tense silence as each of them contemplated the implications of this legal assault. Charlotte stared out the window at the prairie landscape that was now threatened with being taken away from them, and she felt the same determination that had carried her through previous crises beginning to build in her chest. "Uncle Alexander," she said as they approached Cedar Falls, "I need you to arrange meetings with the best legal minds in Kansas Territory. If Kansas Central wants a fight over our inheritance, we'll give them one they won't forget." "Are you sure you want to pursue this course?" Alexander asked. "Legal battles can be expensive, time-consuming, and there's always the risk that we could lose." Victoria closed her sketchbook with decisive finality. "We've already lost everything once and built new lives from nothing. We're not going to let bullies steal what we've rightfully inherited without fighting back. Besides," Charlotte added with growing confidence, "we have advantages that Kansas Central doesn't expect. We understand what it's like to fight for survival, and we're not afraid of taking risks when everything important is at stake." As their train pulled into the Cedar Falls depot, Charlotte realized that the education phase of their inheritance was over. Tomorrow would begin the real test of whether the Whitmore heiresses could protect and expand the empire they had inherited, or whether they would become another casualty of the ruthless business practices that characterized the rapidly changing American West. The battle for their future was about to begin, and Charlotte was determined to prove that the daughters of Sarah Whitmore Morrison had inherited more than just railroad stocks and bank accounts. They had inherited the strength and determination to fight for what was rightfully theirs, and they would not be defeated by opponents who mistook their youth and inexperience for weakness. The lost heiresses had been found, educated, and were now ready to defend their inheritance against anyone who dared to challenge their right to the Whitmore legacy. The war room that Alexander established in the mansion's east wing looked more like a military command center than a traditional business office. Maps of railroad networks covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins indicating Whitmore properties, competitor routes, and strategic choke points that could determine the outcome of their corporate battle. Telegraph equipment chattered constantly, with updates from legal representatives, field managers, and allies across the territory. Charlotte stood before the largest map, studying the intricate web of rail lines that represented their inheritance, while Victoria worked at a drafting table, where she was creating detailed illustrations of damaged infrastructure that could serve as evidence in their legal proceedings. Both sisters had thrown themselves into the fight for their inheritance, with the same determination that had carried them through previous crises. "The preliminary legal response needs to be filed within 10 days, announced Jonathan Mitchell, the distinguished attorney who had arrived from Kansas City to coordinate their defense. Mitchell was a man in his 50s with silver hair and shrewd eyes who specialized in territorial property law and had never lost a case involving railroad inheritance disputes. "What exactly are we responding to?" Charlotte asked, reviewing the legal documents that Kansas Central had filed with the territorial court. The language was deliberately complex, but the underlying challenge was clear enough. They were claiming that the Whitmore sisters had no legal right to inherit anything. "They're attacking on 3 fronts," Mitchell explained, spreading additional documents across the conference table. "First, they're claiming that your parents' marriage was never properly recorded with territorial authorities, making it legally invalid. Second, they're arguing that even if the marriage was valid, your grandfather's disinheritance of your father means the properties never legally passed to your family line. Third, they're claiming that your mother's remarriage to James Morrison constituted abandonment of any Whitmore family claims." Victoria looked up from her illustration work with fire in her eyes. "So they're essentially arguing that we don't exist legally." "That's a crude but accurate summary," Mitchell confirmed. "If they succeed on any of these arguments, you could lose everything." Alexander had been reviewing correspondence from their political allies, and his expression suggested that the news was not encouraging. Senator Harrison sends word that pressure is being applied in Washington to investigate our federal land grants and mail contracts. If Kansas Central can create enough doubt about our legitimacy, they might be able to force a review of all our government agreements. The scope of the attack was becoming clear to Charlotte. This wasn't simply a legal challenge to their inheritance. It was a coordinated assault designed to destroy the Whitmore Railroad empire entirely. They're not just trying to steal our properties, they're trying to eliminate us as competitors by making it impossible for us to operate. Exactly, Alexander confirmed. Kansas Central represents a consortium of Eastern investors who want to control Western Railroad development. The Whitmore Railroad's independence and family ownership structure makes us an obstacle to their plans for monopolistic control. The morning's strategy session was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Mrs. Bennett announced that a delegation from the townspeople of Cedar Falls was requesting an audience, led by Mayor William Henderson and accompanied by several prominent local business owners. Charlotte and Victoria joined Alexander in the mansion's formal parlor to meet with the delegation, wondering what additional complications this development might bring. Mayor Henderson was a portly man in his 60s who had been elected on a platform of supporting local business interests, while his companions represented the merchants and professionals who formed Cedar Falls' economic backbone. "Mr. Whitmore, ladies," Mayor Henderson began with obvious nervousness, "we've come to discuss the situation that's developing around your railroad properties and what it might mean for our community." "What specific concerns do you have?" Alexander asked diplomatically. "Word has reached us about the legal challenges to your inheritance," explained Martha Patterson, who owned the largest general store in town. "There are rumors that Kansas Central Railroad might acquire your properties and make changes that could affect rail service to Cedar Falls." Charlotte understood immediately. Cedar Falls' prosperity depended on its position as a shipping point for agricultural products and a stop for passenger trains traveling between Kansas City and Denver. If Kansas Central gained control of the Whitmore lines, they could redirect traffic to favor their own properties and leave Cedar Falls economically isolated. "What kind of changes are you concerned about?" Victoria asked. "Kansas Central has a reputation for consolidating operations to maximize profits," replied Dr. Samuel Adams, the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens. "They might close our depot, reduce train schedules, or reroute service through competing towns that offer them better financial terms." The delegation's concerns highlighted another dimension of their struggle that Charlotte hadn't fully considered. The Whitmore Railroad wasn't just their personal inheritance, it was infrastructure that supported the livelihoods of thousands of people across multiple communities. "We want you to know," Mayor Henderson continued, "that Cedar Falls stands behind your right to the inheritance and your management of the railroad properties. We're prepared to provide testimony, documentation, or whatever support you need to fight these challenges." Alexander looked genuinely moved by this offer of community support. "Mayor Henderson, that's very generous. What specifically can the town provide?" "Documentation of your family's historical presence and business activities in this region," Dr. Adams replied. "Witness testimony about your grandfather's recognition of your father's marriage and children, and political support for your continued operation of railroad services that benefit local communities." Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected alliance. "We appreciate this support more than you know. Our goal is to maintain and expand railroad services that benefit communities like Cedar Falls, not extract maximum profit at the expense of local economies." After the delegation departed, the Whitmore family returned to their war room with renewed energy for the fight ahead. The community support demonstrated that they had allies beyond their immediate family and business associates. but it also emphasized the stakes involved in their legal battle. "We need to go on the offensive," Charlotte declared, studying the maps that showed Kansas Central's own vulnerable points. "Defending against their attacks isn't enough. We need to create problems for them that force them to divert resources from attacking us." Victoria set down her drawing implements and joined her sister at the strategy table. "What kind of problems?" "Investigation of their own business practices," Alexander suggested with growing enthusiasm. "Kansas Central has acquired numerous properties through questionable methods. If we can document patterns of fraud or coercion, we can turn their legal tactics against them." Jonathan Mitchell looked up from his legal research with interest. "That's an aggressive strategy, but it could be effective. If we can prove that Kansas Central has engaged in systematic fraudulent practices, it undermines their credibility and potentially exposes them to criminal prosecution." The afternoon was spent developing a comprehensive counterattack strategy that would hit Kansas Central on multiple fronts simultaneously. Charlotte coordinated efforts to document suspicious business practices. Victoria worked on creating visual presentations that would make complex evidence accessible to judges and juries, and Alexander managed communications with allies who could provide political and economic pressure. Their planning was interrupted by an urgent telegram from Margaret Thompson in Topeka, reporting a crisis that demanded immediate attention. A freight train carrying valuable cargo had derailed under suspicious circumstances, and preliminary investigation suggested sabotage rather than accidental equipment failure. 3 cars of manufactured goods bound for Denver completely destroyed. Alexander read from the telegram. Track damage consistent with deliberate removal of spikes and loosening of rail joints. No injuries, but cargo loss estimated at $15,000. Charlotte felt her anger building at this escalation. From legal harassment to physical destruction of property, they're not content to fight us in court. Now they're resorting to criminal sabotage. "This could work in our favor," Mitchell observed thoughtfully. "If we can prove that Kansas Central is behind the sabotage, it destroys their credibility and potentially results in criminal charges against their leadership." Victoria had been sketching while they talked, and she showed them a detailed drawing that captured her understanding of the situation. "We need to catch them in the act. Set up surveillance on vulnerable sections of track and document who's responsible for these attacks." The discussion of counter-surveillance strategies was interrupted by another unexpected visitor. Mrs. Bennett announced that Edwin Blackwood was requesting an immediate meeting to discuss what he described as urgent matters affecting both railroad companies. "Interesting timing," Alexander observed grimly. "He shows up just hours after the latest sabotage incident." Charlotte considered the implications of this visit. "Let's see what he has to say. Maybe he'll reveal more than he intends to." Blackwood entered the parlor with his usual confident bearing, but Charlotte noticed subtle signs of tension in his demeanor that suggested the pressure was affecting him as well. "Mr. Whitmore, ladies, I trust you've heard about the unfortunate accident near Topeka." "We've heard about the sabotage," Charlotte corrected pointedly, "though I'm curious how you learned about it so quickly." Blackwood's composure slipped slightly. "At the direct challenge. News travels quickly in railroad circles. I came to express Kansas Central's concern about the safety implications of such incidents." "How thoughtful," Victoria said with barely concealed sarcasm. "I'm sure Kansas Central is deeply concerned about the welfare of Whitmore Railroad properties." Actually, these incidents highlight exactly the kind of operational challenges that make railroad management so difficult for inexperienced owners, Blackwood continued, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "Perhaps it's time to consider whether continued independent operation is in everyone's best interests." Alexander leaned forward with dangerous intensity. "Are you suggesting that Kansas Central might be able to prevent future sabotage if they acquired our properties?" I'm suggesting that companies with greater resources and experience are better positioned to provide security for valuable railroad infrastructure. Blackwood replied carefully. Charlotte stood and moved to face Blackwood directly, drawing upon every lesson in confidence and authority she had learned since inheriting her fortune. Mr. Blackwood, let me be perfectly clear about our position. We will not be intimidated by sabotage. We will not be manipulated by legal harassment, and we will not sell our inheritance to people who mistake our youth for weakness. Furthermore, Victoria added, standing beside her sister in a show of unified determination, we have reason to believe that Kansas Central's acquisition offers are based on artificial crises created through illegal interference with our operations. Blackwood's mask of polite concern finally dropped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. That's a serious accusation, ladies. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims. We're gathering evidence daily, Charlotte replied with quiet confidence, and we're prepared to present that evidence to territorial and federal authorities who take a dim view of criminal interference with interstate commerce. The threat hung in the air with an uncomfortable weight. Blackwood clearly hadn't expected to face such direct opposition from women he had underestimated, and his discomfort was evident as he struggled to maintain his aggressive posture. I trust you'll reconsider your position as circumstances develop, he said finally, preparing to leave. Railroad management involves challenges that can be overwhelming for those without proper experience and support. After Blackwood's departure, the Whitmore family returned to their strategy planning with renewed urgency. The confrontation had confirmed that Kansas Central was indeed behind the sabotage, and it had also demonstrated that their opponents were growing desperate as their initial tactics failed to achieve the desired results. He essentially admitted to the sabotage, Victoria observed, reviewing her sketches of Blackwood's expressions during the meeting. His knowledge of the incident timing and his threats about future overwhelming challenges make it clear that Kansas Central is orchestrating these attacks. The question is whether we can prove it in court, Mitchell cautioned. Blackwood was careful not to make direct admissions that could be used as evidence. Charlotte moved to the window and looked out over the grounds that had become both her home and her fortress. Then we need to force them into making mistakes that provide the evidence we need. We need to make them desperate enough to take risks that expose their criminal activities. Alexander joined her at the window, and together they watched the sunset paint the Kansas prairie in brilliant shades of orange and gold. What do you have in mind? We're going to give them what they think they want, Charlotte said with growing determination. We're going to make them believe they're winning, that we're weakening under pressure, and when they get overconfident and careless, we're going to destroy them. Victoria looked up from her drafting table with excitement. A trap? The biggest trap they've ever walked into, Charlotte confirmed. By the time we're finished with Kansas Central Railroad, they'll regret the day they decided to steal from the Whitmore family. As night fell over Cedar Falls, the mansion's lights burned late into the evening as the Whitmore family refined their plans for the counteroffensive that would determine not only their personal future, but the future of independent railroad development across the Western Territories. The battle for the Whitmore inheritance had escalated from legal maneuvering to criminal sabotage, but Charlotte and Victoria had discovered that they possessed weapons their opponents hadn't anticipated. Community support, moral authority, and the kind of determination that comes from having already lost everything once and refusing to let it happen again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that the daughters of Sarah Whitmore Morrison were worthy, inheritors of more than just railroad stocks and property deeds. They were inheritors of a legacy of strength, intelligence, and refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The lost heiresses had been found, educated, and tested by fire. Now they were ready to show their enemies exactly what they were truly capable of accomplishing when their backs were against the wall and everything they cared about was at stake. The trap was set on a cold November morning, 3 months after the legal battle had begun. Charlotte stood on a windswept hill overlooking the railroad junction where the Whitmore main line intersected with a crucial spur that carried freight from the Colorado mining districts. Below her, seemingly unguarded, sat a special train loaded with what appeared to be the most valuable cargo shipment in Whitmore Railroad history: gold ore, manufactured goods, and railroad bonds worth nearly $50,000. What Kansas Central didn't know was that every car contained carefully constructed decoys, that a dozen armed guards were hidden in concealed positions throughout the area, and that federal marshals were positioned to document whatever criminal activity might unfold. The real valuable cargo had been rerouted through alternate lines days earlier, but Kansas Central's intelligence network had been fed false information, suggesting that this shipment represented a desperate attempt to raise cash for the legal battle. Victoria crouched behind a cluster of boulders with her sketchbook, documenting everything she observed for use as evidence in court. Her artistic skills had proven invaluable for creating detailed records of Kansas Central's sabotage activities, and today's operation would either provide the proof they needed to destroy their enemies or result in their own financial ruin if the plan failed. "They're coming," whispered Samuel Rodriguez, the federal marshal who was coordinating the surveillance operation. 6 men on horseback, approaching from the east. They matched the descriptions of the saboteurs who hit the Topeka line last month. Charlotte felt her heart racing as she watched the riders approach the apparently vulnerable train. Everything they had worked for over the past months depended on the next few hours. If they could catch Kansas Central's agents in the act of criminal sabotage, it would destroy the company's credibility and potentially result in criminal prosecution of their leadership. If the plan failed, they would be left with massive debts from their legal defense and no evidence to support their counter-accusations. The riders dismounted near the locomotive and began working with practiced efficiency to attach explosive devices to the track ahead of the train. Through field glasses, Charlotte could see their faces clearly, and she recognized 2 of them as men who had been observed near previous sabotage sites. The federal marshals would have everything they needed to prove the connection between these attacks and Kansas Central's systematic campaign of destruction. But as Charlotte watched the saboteurs work, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the men was looking directly at her hiding position with field glasses of his own, and his expression suggested that he was not surprised to find observers present. "They know it's a trap," she whispered urgently to Marshal Rodriguez. "We need to move now, before they escape." Rodriguez signaled to his hidden agents, and suddenly the quiet hillside erupted with activity as federal marshals emerged from concealment to surround the saboteurs. What followed was a brief but intense gun battle that ended with 4 of the saboteurs captured and 2 escaping into the rough country beyond the railroad junction. Charlotte and Victoria emerged from their hiding positions to observe the aftermath, watching as the captured men were searched and questioned. Among the evidence seized were detailed maps of Whitmore Railroad properties, written instructions for sabotage operations, and most importantly, a letter from Edwin Blackwood authorizing payment for services rendered in connection with competitive intelligence gathering. "This is everything we need," announced Jonathan Mitchell, who had observed the operation from a position near the railroad cars. Direct written evidence linking Kansas Central to systematic criminal sabotage of Whitmore Railroad properties. But the victory celebration was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected observer. Silas Blackthorne, the predatory lender who had originally threatened the Morrison family, rode up to the scene with several armed companions and a smile that suggested he wasn't surprised by the day's developments. Quite an elaborate operation, Blackthorne said, dismounting with casual confidence, though I suspect you'll find that catching saboteurs is easier than proving conspiracy charges against their employers. Charlotte felt a chill of recognition as she realized that Blackthorne's presence couldn't be coincidental. "What are you doing here?" Representing certain business interests that have been concerned about the stability of railroad operations in this region, Blackthorne replied, smoothly. "It seems that Whitmore Railroad properties have been experiencing unusual difficulties that affect investor confidence." Alexander stepped forward with dangerous intensity. "Blackthorne, if you're working with Kansas Central, you're making a serious mistake. We have enough evidence to destroy everyone involved in this conspiracy." Evidence that might be difficult to present if the witnesses were to meet with unfortunate accidents, Blackthorne suggested with barely concealed menace. "Railroad operations can be dangerous, and people who involve themselves in situations beyond their understanding sometimes face unexpected consequences." The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that Charlotte realized Blackthorne represented a level of danger they hadn't fully anticipated. But before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of additional reinforcements, not for Blackthorne, but for the Whitmore family. Mayor Henderson led a group of 30 armed men from Cedar Falls, followed by railroad workers from Topeka, and behind them a detachment of territorial militia that had been summoned by telegraph. Within minutes, Blackthorne's small group was outnumbered 10-1 by people whose livelihoods depended on Whitmore Railroad operations. "Mr. Blackthorne," Mayor Henderson called out with grim satisfaction, "I think you'll find that threatening the Whitmore family is not a popular position in this territory." Blackthorne looked around at the assembled crowd with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that his intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly. "This is a private business matter that doesn't concern local authorities. Threatening federal witnesses and interfering with criminal investigations concerns everyone," Marshal Rodriguez replied, stepping forward with handcuffs. "Silas Blackthorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit sabotage and intimidation of federal witnesses." The arrest of Blackthorne marked the turning point in their struggle against Kansas Central. Within days, the evidence gathered from the sabotage operation led to criminal charges against Edwin Blackwood and several other Kansas Central executives, while the documented conspiracy resulted in federal investigation of the company's business practices across multiple territories. The legal battle that had threatened to destroy the Whitmore inheritance collapsed when Kansas Central's credibility was destroyed by the criminal revelations. Not only were their challenges to Charlotte and Victoria's inheritance dismissed by the territorial court, but the company was forced to pay massive fines and compensation for damages caused by their illegal activities. 2 weeks after the successful trap operation, Charlotte stood in the same courthouse where she had been auctioned months earlier, but this time she was there to accept formal recognition of her inheritance and to witness the sentencing of the men who had tried to steal it from her. The contrast with her previous appearance was striking. Instead of facing an uncertain future as someone else's property, she was now recognized as one of the most powerful business leaders in Kansas Territory. Judge Hartley, who had reluctantly conducted her auction, now smiled with genuine pleasure as he formally validated the Whitmore sisters' inheritance. "Miss Charlotte Whitmore and Miss Victoria Whitmore, this court recognizes your legitimate inheritance of all properties, assets, and business interests previously owned by the Whitmore Railroad Company. Furthermore, this court awards damages in the amount of $75,000 to compensate for losses incurred during the illegal interference with your business operations." The victory was complete, but Charlotte knew that their real achievement went far beyond simply protecting their inheritance. They had proven that young women could successfully manage complex business operations. that family loyalty could overcome organized opposition, and that communities would support leaders who demonstrated genuine concern for their welfare. The months that followed brought rapid expansion of Whitmore Railroad operations as Charlotte and Victoria applied the lessons they had learned during their struggle against Kansas Central. They established employee benefit programs that became models for other companies, invested in community development projects that strengthened the towns along their rail lines, and pioneered new approaches to railroad management that emphasized cooperation rather than exploitation. Victoria's artistic talents found expression in designing beautiful station buildings and passenger cars that made rail travel more enjoyable, while Charlotte's organizational skills transformed the company's efficiency and profitability. Working together, they expanded the railroad network into new territories while maintaining the family values that had guided their mother and uncle. The personal relationships that had developed during their crisis also evolved in unexpected directions. Alexander, relieved of the burden of managing the railroad empire alone, was able to pursue his own interests in technological innovation and Western development. James Morrison, sober and proud of his daughter's achievements, found meaningful work as a consultant, helping other railroad companies implement the employee welfare programs the Whitmore sisters had pioneered. On a warm spring evening in 1891, nearly 2 years after the auction that had changed their lives, Charlotte and Victoria stood together on the veranda of their mansion, watching the sunset paint the Kansas prairie in brilliant colors. The transformation in their circumstances still seemed almost dreamlike, but the hard work and challenges they had overcome had made their success feel genuinely earned. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Uncle Alexander hadn't come to the auction?" Victoria asked, her sketchbook filled with drawings that captured the beauty of their surroundings. "Sometimes," Charlotte replied thoughtfully, "but I think we would have found a way to survive and build something meaningful, even under the worst circumstances. We had already learned the most important lesson, that our strength comes from supporting each other and refusing to accept defeat." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram from Washington, where Congress was considering legislation that would regulate railroad business practices and protect small communities from exploitation by large corporations. The Whitmore sisters had been invited to testify about their experiences and recommendations for fair business practices. "Another adventure," Victoria observed with excitement, "though I suspect Washington politics will be more challenging than anything we faced with Kansas Central." "We'll face it the same way we've faced everything else," Charlotte said with confidence, "together with careful planning and with the knowledge that we're fighting for something larger than just our own interests." As night fell over the prairie, lights began to appear in the windows of houses throughout Cedar Falls and the other communities that depended on Whitmore Railroad operations. Each light represented families whose lives had been made better by the sisters' commitment to responsible business practices and community development. Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from the auction block to positions of influence and responsibility. The frightened girl, who had stood on the courthouse steps facing an uncertain future, had been transformed into a confident woman who helped shape the economic development of the Western Territories. But perhaps the most important transformation had been the discovery that wealth and power were not ends in themselves, but tools that could be used to create opportunities for others. The Whitmore Railroad had become more than a successful business. It was a force for positive change that demonstrated how private enterprise could serve public good. "You know," Victoria said as they prepared to go inside, "I've been thinking about Mother and what she would say about everything that's happened to us. What do you think she would say?" "I think she would be proud that we used our inheritance to build something that benefits others, not just ourselves." And I think she would be pleased that we found a way to honor both sides of our heritage, the Morrison family values of hard work and community service, and the Whitmore family tradition of leadership and innovation. Charlotte nodded, feeling the truth of Victoria's observation. She sacrificed her inheritance to give us the chance to become the people we were meant to be. I hope we've proven worthy of that sacrifice. As they entered the mansion that had become both their home and their headquarters, Charlotte realized that their story was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that the Whitmore Railroad could continue to grow while maintaining the principles that had guided their recovery from near disaster. The lost heiresses had been found, had fought for their inheritance, and had proven themselves worthy of the legacy they had inherited. But more than that, they had created a new legacy for future generations, one that showed how strength, determination, and commitment to others could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The girl who had been auctioned to pay her father's debts had become a woman who used her wealth and influence to ensure that other families would never face the kind of desperation that had once threatened to destroy her own. It was a transformation that went far beyond mere financial success, and it represented the kind of victory that could inspire others for generations to come. The winter of 1892 brought unexpected challenges that would test everything Charlotte and Victoria had built. A severe blizzard struck the territory in February, isolating communities for weeks and stranding dozens of trains across their network. The crisis demanded immediate action to prevent both human tragedy and financial disaster. Charlotte established an emergency command center in the mansion's library, coordinating rescue operations while Victoria organized relief supplies for stranded passengers and isolated communities. They worked 18-hour days, sleeping in shifts to maintain continuous oversight of operations that now employed over 800 people across 5 territories. "We have 3 passenger trains stuck between Junction City and Abilene," reported Thomas McCarthy over the telegraph. "Food supplies are running low, and 1 car has a pregnant woman who may deliver before we can reach them. Deploy the relief train from Topeka with medical supplies and Dr. Williams," Charlotte responded immediately. "Use the rotary snowplow from the Denver depot to clear the main line first, then work on the branch routes." Victoria looked up from her logistics charts, her face showing the strain of continuous crisis management. "Charlotte, the relief operations are costing us nearly $1,000 per day. If this weather continues much longer, we'll exhaust our emergency reserves." "Then we'll find more money," Charlotte replied firmly. "We don't abandon people in crisis because of financial considerations. That's exactly the kind of thinking that made Kansas Central our enemy." The blizzard crisis became a defining moment for the Whitmore Railroad's reputation. While competing companies focused on protecting their equipment and minimizing losses, Charlotte and Victoria spent their personal fortunes to ensure that every passenger reached safety and every isolated community received essential supplies. When the weather finally cleared in March, the territorial newspapers were filled with stories of Whitmore Railroad heroism. Families reunited after weeks of uncertainty, communities saved from starvation, and medical emergencies resolved through the sisters' determination to put human welfare above profit margins. The positive publicity translated into increased business, as people throughout the region began to trust Whitmore Railroad with their most important transportation needs. But more significantly, it established Charlotte and Victoria as leaders whose word could be trusted and whose values aligned with the communities they served. Spring brought new opportunities for expansion when the territorial government announced plans for a railroad connection to the Pacific coast. The project would require massive investment and coordination with federal authorities, but it offered the chance to extend Whitmore Railroad operations into entirely new markets. This could double our revenue within 5 years, Alexander explained as they reviewed the government proposals. But it would also require us to take on debt and obligations that could destroy us if the project fails. Charlotte studied the maps, showing the proposed route through challenging mountain terrain. What are the risks beyond financial? Engineering. Challenges that have never been attempted before, Alexander replied. Mountain passes that will require tunneling through solid rock, bridges across canyons that span hundreds of feet, and construction in weather conditions that could kill workers if safety precautions aren't maintained. Victoria had been sketching potential designs for mountain railway stations, her artistic vision helping to solve practical problems of construction and operation. What about partnering with other railroad companies? Sharing both the risks and the benefits? The other major companies have already indicated they're not interested in cooperation, Alexander said. They'd prefer to see us fail attempting this project than acquire our assets when we're forced into bankruptcy. Charlotte felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through previous crises. Then we'll do it ourselves. We'll build the safest, most efficient mountain railroad in American history, and we'll prove that cooperation and careful planning can overcome obstacles that defeat companies focused only on profit. The Pacific Railroad project became the defining challenge of Charlotte and Victoria's careers. They spent months studying engineering reports, consulting with experts, and developing innovative solutions to construction problems that had stymied previous attempts at mountain railroad building. Victoria's artistic talents proved invaluable for visualizing construction challenges and designing stations that could withstand extreme weather conditions. Charlotte's organizational skills coordinated the massive logistics of moving equipment and supplies to remote construction sites. Accessible only by horseback or mule train, the construction phase lasted 3 years and tested every aspect of their leadership abilities. They faced avalanches that destroyed months of work, equipment failures that required redesigning entire sections of track, and political opposition from competitors who used their influence to create regulatory obstacles. But they also discovered the satisfaction of solving problems that others considered impossible and building something that would benefit generations of travelers and communities. Each mile of completed track represented victory over both natural obstacles and human opposition. The completion ceremony for the Pacific Railroad connection took place on a brilliant autumn day in 1895, with representatives from territorial and federal governments joining thousands of local residents to celebrate the achievement. Charlotte and Victoria stood together as the final spike was driven, watching the first through train begin its journey from Kansas to the Pacific coast. 6 years ago, we were being auctioned to pay gambling debts, Victoria whispered to her sister as the crowd cheered around them. Now we're opening transportation routes that will shape the development of the entire western United States. And we did it by refusing to accept that our circumstances defined our possibilities, Charlotte replied. Mother would be proud of how we used the inheritance she preserved for us. The success of the Pacific Railroad project established Charlotte and Victoria as national figures in the railroad industry. They were invited to speak at engineering conferences, consulted by government officials planning infrastructure projects, and recognized as pioneers in both technical innovation and corporate responsibility. But perhaps their most important achievement was the model they created for business leadership that prioritized community welfare alongside profit maximization. The Whitmore Railroad's employee benefit programs, community investment initiatives, and safety standards became templates that other companies adopted throughout the growing industrial economy. On the 10th anniversary of their inheritance, Charlotte and Victoria hosted a celebration that brought together railroad workers, community leaders, government officials, and family members from across their network. The mansion's gardens, were filled with people whose lives had been touched by the sisters' commitment to using wealth responsibly. James Morrison, now 60, and serving as the company's employee relations director, raised a toast to his daughters. 10 years ago, I thought I had lost everything that mattered to me. Instead, I discovered that I had raised daughters who could transform disaster into triumph and use their success to lift up everyone around them. Alexander, grayer now but still energetic in his role as technical advisor, added his own tribute. Charlotte and Victoria have proven that the Whitmore family tradition of leadership and innovation is in excellent hands for the next generation. As the celebration continued into the evening, Charlotte and Victoria found themselves standing together in the mansion's library, surrounded by the maps and documents that chronicled their journey from desperate poverty to national prominence. "What do you think comes next?" Victoria asked, her latest sketchbook filled with drawings of the day's festivities. "I think we keep building," Charlotte replied thoughtfully. "There are still communities that need better transportation, still workers who deserve fair treatment, still problems that require creative solutions, and still people who will try to stop us," Victoria added with a smile that showed she relished the prospect of future challenges. "Let them try," Charlotte said with the confidence that had carried her through a decade of seemingly impossible obstacles. "We've learned that the most important victories come from refusing to give up when everyone expects you to fail." Years later, when historians wrote about the development of the American West, they would note the unusual story of twin sisters who inherited a railroad empire and used it to pioneer new approaches to corporate responsibility and community development. But Charlotte and Victoria would always remember that their real victory had been much simpler. They had refused to let circumstances beyond their control define their future, and they had discovered that the most important inheritance of all was the strength to keep fighting for what they believed in, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The Whitmore Railroad continued to grow and prosper under their leadership, eventually becoming one of the largest transportation companies in North America. But its true legacy was not measured in miles of track or financial profits, but in the thousands of families whose lives were improved by leaders who understood that real success meant lifting others up rather than climbing over them. The girl, who had stood on an auction block facing an uncertain future, had become a woman who used her power to ensure that others would never face the desperation she had once known. It was a transformation that inspired generations of leaders who followed, proving that the greatest victories often begin with the courage to survive the darkest moments. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.